Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to tackle something that's super relevant right now. All these boycotts popping up, especially with Trump back in office. It's like a whole new wave of political pushback.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how it's all unfolding.
So we've got three sources to dig into today.
Okay.
First, there's this CNN video that breaks down how effective boycotts actually are, historically and all that.
Okay.
Then we've got this piece from People's World that's all fired up about this economic blackout thing they're pushing for.
Right.
And lastly, there's a CBS News article that really gets into the nitty-gritty of what this February 28th boycott is all about. What's wild is that it's all happening right now as we speak, which makes it even more fascinating to unpack, right?
Absolutely. What I find particularly intriguing is that these boycotts are emerging in direct response to the major shifts we're seeing in the political landscape.
Oh, for sure. It's like everything's changing so fast. You've got Trump back in the White House, Elon Musk shaking things up with his Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, as they're calling it.
Right.
And, well, people are not exactly thrilled about it.
That's putting it mildly. The sources we have definitely point to a lot of simmering discontent, and it's manifesting in all sorts of ways.
Totally. The CNN video actually shows some really powerful examples of this. Like, there's this moment where Janet Mills, the governor of Maine, is directly challenging Trump over his executive order on transgender athletes. And then there's this striking image, you can't miss it, of an upside-down American flag hanging from El Capitan in Yosemite. It's a protest against the cuts to National Park staff. Talk about a visual statement.
Wow.
And then you've got this wave of tech workers resigning from DOGE en masse, all protesting what the department is doing. I mean, it's ALIT.
It is. And what's fascinating is how these examples really highlight the diversity of the resistance we're seeing. You've got politicians pushing back, activists making bold statements, even employees within the system itself saying enough is enough. It really speaks to how widespread this discontent truly is.
Yeah, it's everywhere you look. Okay, so let's zero in on boycotts specifically. They're not new, obviously, but it feels like they're making a serious comeback as a form of protest these days.
It does, and the CNN video really explores that, looking at the history of boycotts and what makes them effective.
Right, and they use this recent example that really caught my attention, the Bud Light boycott. Remember that whole thing?
Oh, yeah.
Bud Light partnered with a transgender influencer, and the backlash was huge.
Ah.
But what's interesting is that the boycott actually worked. Bud Light ended up losing its top spot in the U.S. beer market, first time in 2 decades? It's crazy.
Yeah.
So that begs the question, why was this boycott so effective? What made it different?
Well, I think there are a few key factors at play there. First off, the call for a boycott actually came from Bud Light's core customer base. It wasn't just a fringe group or anything. It was the people who actually buy and drink Bud Light regularly.
Right, so it hit them where it hurts.
Exactly. Second, there were a ton of alternatives readily available. People could just switch to a different beer without really thinking twice about it.
Makes sense.
And then there was the messaging. It was super clear and easy to grasp. People knew exactly why they were boycotting, and it resonated with them on a gut level.
That makes sense. I'm curious, though, do you think that kind of success can be replicated with something like this economic blackout planned for February 28th? I mean, that's a whole different beast.
That's a good question. This boycott is calling for people to avoid buying anything from major corporations for a whole day. That's a pretty ambitious goal, and I have to admit, I'm a little skeptical about how effective it can really be.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that? I mean, it sounds pretty powerful on paper.
It does. But for a boycott to truly work, it needs to meet two key criteria. First, the boycott has to come from the actual customers of the brands or companies being targeted.
Okay, so the people actually buying the stuff.
Right. And second, there need to be readily available and appealing alternatives for those customers to switch to.
Got it.
So think about the February 28th boycott for a second. Can people realistically abstain from buying anything from all major corporations for an entire day?
It's a tall order, for sure.
It is. And even if they can, what are the readily available alternatives? It's not always that simple. It's not like switching from one beer to another.
So are you saying this whole economic blackout thing is doomed to fail?
Not necessarily. But it does raise some important questions about feasibility and impact. Can individuals really commit to such a broad boycott? And will it actually achieve the intended political outcome? Those are things we just don't know yet.
Fair enough. Now let's throw another layer onto this whole boycott conversation. The backlash against Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, as
Yeah.
everyone's calling it. It's like this whole other dimension to the pushback we're seeing.
Yeah, and it's definitely tied to Trump's return to power. It's like there's been this seismic shift in the political climate, and companies are scrambling to figure out where they stand.
Totally. The CBS News article talks about how some consumers are actually calling for boycotts of companies like Target, Amazon, and Walmart because they feel like these companies are backing away from their DEI commitments. It's like they're being pulled in two completely opposite directions.
It's a real tightrope walk for them. And the People's World op-ed offers a very different perspective on this. They argue that this corporate retreat from DEI is basically a surrender to pressure from racist elements within the MAGA movement. They see it as a deeply troubling development.
So you have these companies stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, there's pressure from conservative activists in the Trump administration to scale back their DEI programs. But on the other hand, if they ditch those initiatives entirely, they risk alienating a huge chunk of their customers and maybe even losing valuable employees who believe in those values. It's a tough spot to be in.
It really is. And the CNN video actually provides some concrete examples of how companies are trying to navigate this complexity. They highlight Target specifically, which was initially very vocal about their support for DEI, but they've definitely scaled back some of their programs since then. It's like they're trying to appease everyone and maybe ending up satisfying no one.
It's tough to strike that balance. But what about the legal challenges that are starting to pop up around DEI? That seems to be adding a whole other layer of complexity to this whole situation.
Oh, absolutely. The legal landscape is definitely shifting, and it's creating a lot of uncertainty. The CNN video dives into this, highlighting how unclear things are when it comes to the legality of certain DEI initiatives in the corporate world. It's like this giant gray area right now, and no one's quite sure how it's going to shake out.
Yeah, it's a bit of a legal minefield. They bring up the lawsuit against Starbucks. The Attorney General of Missouri, he's actually claiming that their DEI policies are discriminatory. Crazy, right?
Yeah.
It's a pretty high-profile case that really shows how this whole debate about diversity in the workplace is ending up in court.
It really does. And how these cases play out could have a huge impact on how effective these boycotts are down the road. You know, if courts start ruling that certain DEI programs are actually illegal, it could totally undermine the efforts of those who are using boycotts to pressure companies to keep those programs or even expand them.
It makes you wonder, are we going to see more lawsuits popping up, targeting companies that are trying to promote diversity? And then how are consumers going to react if those lawsuits actually win? It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture here.
Okay.
What does all of this mean for us as individuals? I mean, we're talking about the boycotts, the pushback against DEI, the whole political climate. It's a lot to process.
It is. And the sources we've been looking at, they offer some insights, but honestly, they raise even more questions.
Oh, totally. Like the People's World op-ed, they're super passionate about this economic blackout, you know?
Right.
They're urging everyone to hit those corporations where it hurts their profits.
Yeah.
Their whole argument is that protest works. The more people who participate, the bigger the impact.
Right. That's definitely their perspective. But I think it's important to consider other viewpoints as well. The CNN piece actually brings up critics who argue that these large-scale boycotts, they can actually end up hurting minority-owned businesses that rely on those big corporations.
Oh, that's a really good point. It's not always so black and white.
It's not.
And then there's this whole question of whether these boycotts actually achieve what they set out to do. I mean, yeah, the Bud Light boycott worked, but that was a very specific, targeted campaign. What about these larger scale efforts, like the February 28th boycott?
That's something we'll have to see how it plays out. The success of something like that really hinges on a few factors: how many people actually participate, whether there are viable alternatives to the companies being targeted, and how those corporations actually respond to the pressure. There's a lot of variables at play there.
So many moving parts. And we can't forget about social media and the role it plays in all of this.
Oh, absolutely.
It seems like every time there's a call for a boycott, it spreads like wildfire online.
It does. Social media has become this incredibly powerful tool for organizing and spreading information about these movements. The CNN video talks about how those viral calls to action and celebrity endorsements can really amplify these boycotts.
Like Stephen King's tweet, right? He urged people to avoid buying anything on February 28th. That must have reached millions of people.
Exactly. And that kind of reach can definitely translate into real-world action. But on the flip side, We have to remember that social media can be a breeding ground for misinformation and manipulation. It's not always easy to separate fact from fiction.
That's true. We can't just blindly believe everything we see online.
We can't.
It's more important than ever to be critical consumers of information, to really think about where it's coming from and what the motivations might be, especially when we're talking about stuff like boycotts and political activism.
100%. It's crucial to evaluate your sources, look for different perspectives, and really engage in thoughtful discussion and debate. These boycotts are bringing up really important conversations about things like corporate responsibility, social justice, and the power of consumer choice. And they're forcing us to ask ourselves some tough questions about where we stand on these issues and how we can use our voices and, honestly, our wallets to shape the world around us.
It feels like we're at this crossroads, and these boycotts are like a big flashing sign of that. But let's bring it back to the legal challenges around DEI for a minute. The CNN video makes this really interesting point. They say that even though the Trump administration is cracking down on what they call illegal DEI, the actual laws haven't actually changed.
Yeah, that's what makes it so confusing for a lot of companies. They're not sure how to move forward with their diversity initiatives because the rules seem to be changing without actually changing. It's creating this whole climate of uncertainty, which just leads to more legal battles, like that Starbucks case we were talking about.
It's a mess. And what I found really fascinating is that this whole crackdown might actually be good news for lawyers who specialize in advising companies on DEI stuff. The CNN piece mentioned that those lawyers are in high demand right now.
It really illustrates that law of unintended consequences. You know, as the political and social landscape shifts, new opportunities and challenges pop up in unexpected places.
Exactly. And this whole situation with DEI just highlights how companies are walking this tightrope right now. The CNN video mentions that some companies, like Ford, they're making these subtle changes to their DEI programs, maybe changing job titles or toning down their messaging, but they're not giving up on that core commitment to diversity.
Right. It's like they're trying to fly under the radar, avoid becoming a target for the Trump administration or those right-wing activists, but at the same time, they want to hold on to their values.
But as the CNN piece points out, that can be confusing for consumers. If a company changes how they talk about DEI or they cut back on their programs, does that mean they don't care about diversity anymore? It's not always clear.
It's not, and that lack of clarity can really breed mistrust and frustration, which can end up fueling these boycott movements. Consumers want to know where companies stand, and they want to be able to make choices that align with their own values.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole thing so complicated. How are we as consumers supposed to figure out which companies to support or boycott when the landscape is constantly shifting and the information we're getting is often murky or even contradictory?
It's a real challenge. We have to be really careful about the information we're consuming, critically evaluating those sources, and actively seeking out diverse perspectives. And we have to be aware of our own biases and assumptions and be willing to challenge those as well.
It's not easy.
It's not.
But it's so important. I mean, the choices we make as consumers have real consequences.
They do.
They can impact not only the companies we choose to support or boycott, but also the broader social and political landscape.
That's a really crucial point. Our purchasing power is a form of political expression, and we need to be using it consciously and thoughtfully.
It really makes you stop and think. You know, as we wrap up this deep dive into boycotts and DEI and all the pushback since Trump got back in office, I keep coming back to one question. Can boycotts actually make a real difference? Or are they just like a way for people to vent their frustration? You know what I mean?
It's a tough one, and honestly, I don't think there's an easy answer. The stuff we've looked at today, it shows strong arguments on both sides.
Right.
We've seen how boycotts can definitely hit a company's bottom line. I mean, look at Bud Light. But we've also seen how hard it can be to actually organize and keep up a boycott, especially a big one, when there's not a clear agreement on who the targets are or what people are actually trying to accomplish.
All right, it's got to be focused.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole ethical side of it, too. The People's World piece, they're totally gung-ho about this economic blackout, right?
Yeah.
They say it's crucial. It's how we fight back against corporations that are caving to pressure from the MAGA crowd. But like we talked about earlier, there's that worry that boycotting so broadly could end up hurting minority-owned businesses, which is obviously not what anyone wants.
Yeah, it's a real catch-22. And it shows how important it is to be really strategic and think things through when you're talking about boycotts.
For sure.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that boycotts, they're just one tool They're part of a much bigger toolbox of ways to be an activist and make your voice heard.
That's a great way to put it. It's not a magic bullet.
Right.
Sometimes taking direct action, like protests or strikes, that might be the better way to go. Or sometimes it might be more effective to try and talk to companies directly, pressure them to do the right thing. Or even just support those organizations that are already out there fighting for social justice.
Yeah, and we can't forget about voting.
Oh, that's huge.
In the end, if you want to make real changes, lasting changes to the system, you got to get political.
So true. So maybe the question isn't, do boycotts work? But more like, how can we use them in a way that actually makes a difference? As part of a bigger plan for making things better.
Exactly.
And that's something each of us has to figure out, right? As we're trying to navigate this world that's always changing and throwing new curveballs our way.
It is.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the specifics of this February 28th economic blackout, and then we zoomed out and looked at the bigger picture of using boycotts to push back against what's happening politically. I hope this deep dive gave you, our listener, a lot to think about as you consider your own role in shaping the world around you.
Yeah, maybe you'll decide to join the blackout. Or maybe you'll find other ways to make your voice heard. The important thing is to get involved, think critically about what's going on, and make choices that you can stand behind.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, everyone, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and remember, your choices, they matter.